Dr. Stephen Pacala is the Frederick D. Petrie Professor of Ecology and Evolutionary Biology at Princeton University, where he also directs the Carbon Mitigation Initiative, an effort to develop solutions to the greenhouse warming problem. Dr. Pacala is one of the most important leaders on the most issue facing the planet. He's an active member of the National Academy of Sciences, having chaired the Academy's Committee on Carbon Dioxide Removal and Sequestration, which released a very important report in 2018, and recently chaired the Academy's Engineering and Medicine Committee that produced an important report on accelerating decarbonization of the US energy system. And you'll hear about that report tonight. In his spare time, Dr. Pacala serves on the board of the Environmental Defense Fund, and he's a founder and chairman of the board of Climate Central, a nonprofit media organization focusing on climate change. He has an undergraduate degree from Dartmouth College and a PhD in biology from Stanford University, and we're so pleased to have him here with us.
I'm going to talk to you today about a plan to stop U.S. emissions of greenhouse gases altogether over the next 30 years. I've got a slide presentation. So Nicholas, if you could bring up the first one. All right, so I chaired this committee of the National Academies of Science, Engineering, and Medicine that released a plan, a policy portfolio for decarbonizing the U.S. economy, and it was released to the public on February 2nd. The plan is the only one like it that provides both a technical analysis and policy portfolio for actually building all the hardware, and a policy portfolio for handling the social dimensions of a transition this extensive. And I want to say at the outset that I think that these social dimensions are really where the action is for reasons that'll become clear. Next slide, please. So the problem here, this shows US emissions historically. And you can see where we are about 2020, where the line becomes straight. And that straight line is a decarbonization trajectory for the US that goes from the emissions today, which are at about, 5 gigatons or so per annum, 5 billion metric tons of greenhouse gas emissions today, to zero on a linear ramp. And what you see behind it to the left are the historical emissions. The blue are CO2 emissions. The orange are non-CO2 greenhouse gases, much of it agricultural. And the gray are our forest and agricultural sinks. And at the end, the stuff below the line, the gray, has to balance the gold and the blue. And that means then that the country wouldn't any longer contribute to global warming. Now, before I get started, I should say that this proposal shares an enormous amount with what the Biden team has announced. And of course, that's not an accident. You may know that President Biden recently announced that the US would have its greenhouse gas emissions by 2030. This one says go from where we are now to zero in 2050, which sounds slower, but let's superimpose the Biden plan on top of this, and you can see that they're actually the same thing. It's a question of marketing, right? So President Biden wanted to be able to say a 50% drop by 2030 to address the concerns of the greenest side of his base, and so he took as a baseline 2005, whereas we talk about starting today. Next slide, please. All right, so what I want to do before I talk about what's in this plan, I want to talk about what I learned, what we learned through it. So first of all, we read and reviewed just about everything that had ever been written on this subject and took testimony from a lot of the work that was in progress, maybe all of it. And since its release, I've spent innumerable virtual sessions that were congressional meetings, including testimony, at meetings with the administration. And of course, beforehand, we talked to everybody as well. So I want to talk about some of the things I've learned because I've been in this business a long time, and some of these things really surprised me. I should also say that in addition to our policy portfolio handling both the technical aspects of the transition and the socio-economic aspects of the transition, it focuses specifically on the actions that we need over the next 10 years. And they're embedded, of course, in a 30-year complete decarbonization, but the next 10 years are really key, and they're, of course, the ones that are actionable. So everything I'm going to be talking about initially is what we need to do over the next 10 years. Next slide, please. So the first lesson is that deep decarbonization, all the way to net zero, is feasible and economic. And this should surprise you because it surprises experts in the business. The line in the figure is the fraction of GDP we've spent as a nation on energy from 1970 through 2020. And then there's a bunch of colors to the right of that. And those are projections about what it would cost now to go all the way to net zero. And the important take-home message is everyone has concluded that to go all the way to net zero from our current fossil-dominated energy system, we would need to spend a smaller fraction of GDP over the next 30 years than we've spent over the last 30 years, all right? And so this is a spectacular change. It amounts to around $200 billion cumulatively over the 2020s, or about $20 billion a year, much lower than most people would have thought. Opponents of any action in Congress never mention cost behind closed doors anymore. Now, it is also true that you hear a lot of talk about $2.1 trillion plans and that sort of thing. And it's important to understand that that's the incremental capital required, and capital isn't a cost. Wind and solar now provide the lowest cost of electricity, not because they have the lowest capital requirement, but once you build them, you don't have to spend on fuel anymore. So the total cost, operating it and the capital cost, is lower. Same thing is true of an electric car, incidentally. All right, next slide, please. This slide simply shows why it's the case that the costs have declined so spectacularly. Over the last 10 years alone, the cost of solar has declined 90%, wind by 70%, and lithium-ion batteries by 85%. The graph on the right shows this over a much longer time period, with the 1,000-fold decrease in the cost of solar since 1970. All of that fueled, incidentally, by subsidies that got market competition going for a limited market when the stuff was still really expensive. And then through market competition, capitalism worked and relentlessly drove the cost of these things down. Now, if you're using data that's even 3 years old, you think, because the cost of solar is declining by half every 3 years. If you're using data even 3 years old, you think solar is twice as expensive as it is, all right? And so using the most recent data now, it turns out that the cost of the transition is almost zero. It's actually smaller than the health benefit just from closing the coal plants alone. So the great news in Washington is nobody is saying this is too expensive anymore behind closed doors, all right? Maybe saying so in front of the media, but nobody says it behind closed doors. Next slide, please. Now, on the other hand, everybody is worried about the social dimensions of the transition. So on the green side and on the liberal side, there's real concern that we have a fair and equitable transition with public participation in decision-making. We have an energy system that has enshrined environmental injustice in it. Historically marginalized populations have for too long disproportionately borne the brunt of fossil pollution, and we can't have this continue, and disproportionately not shared in the benefits of fossil energy. And so for pragmatic reasons, we need an inclusive process that eliminates or attempts to eliminate this injustice. The alternative, incidentally, it's also pragmatic to do this, but the alternative is to get a yellow vest movement going, like the one you see here in Paris last winter, where people who are disgruntled because they haven't been consulted and because they haven't been taken care of stop the progress. Next slide, please. This just simply shows one example of the of environmental injustice. It's an air pollution index by ethnicity. You can see the Black and Pacific and Asian Islander populations have much more exposure to air pollution than other groups. Next slide, please. It is also true, though, that the transition, because wind and solar in particular is so much more extensive geographically, that you get a net increase in energy jobs on top of any changes in manufacturing jobs, net zero manufacturing jobs that you might get. There are different claims about this. We came down to a number that's between 1 and 2 million net new jobs over the next decade. And it's important to understand these are energy jobs. And in a country with almost full employment, you don't increase employment, you just take employment from one place and put it in another. So the question is, are these new jobs, are they good jobs? And the biggest concern on the Republican side of the aisle, and a serious concern on both sides of the aisle, is the following. Next slide. Now, this thing is busy, I'll warn you. At Princeton, we did a thing called the Net Zero America Project, which is the most extensive engineering study of the transition to a net zero economy that's ever been done. And it's down geographically to a 6-kilometer grid. And so this is incredibly useful for this academy's work. And it was done by design, right? I mean, we started this on purpose. In any case, this thing shows a bunch of graphs. Each graph corresponds to a different state, and they show employment in energy jobs through time. Now, almost every state you look at, the graph is going up to the right, and that means it's gaining jobs, gaining jobs, gaining jobs. And that's because the wind and solar is geographically distributed. But there are 5 states, if you look at them, Texas, Oklahoma, Wyoming, and West Virginia among them, to get declines because they're concentrated centers of fossil jobs. And these people, historically, when we've had a technological transformation, we've just thrown the legacy workers under the bus. And we do so this time politically at our peril. So the question is, what can we do for these people? Next slide, please. Now, we have a policy portfolio that's designed to address that issue, but I don't think it goes far enough. I've agreed to extend this academy study for another year to look specifically at this issue. It turns out that, the Biden team has a real interest in net zero, in manufacturing job revitalization and re-onshoring some of our industries. And the question is it possible to do proactive job creation, particularly in those regions with high concentrations of fossil jobs, to create employment booms to compensate for the coming declines? And so that's the question that we want to answer. And my guess is the answer is yes, but we'll see. Next slide, please. One other thing I want to bring out for you, because many of you, the fact that you're at a meeting of the Watershed Institute means that you care about the landscape that surrounds you. I want you to think carefully about the kind of net zero energy system that we're going to end up with. This is a picture of the wind and solar deployment, the electricity transmission deployment in the cheapest of them. If we went to a 100% renewable system, that is no nukes and no fossil with carbon capture and storage, there would be twice this much wind and solar. The blue stuff is wind, and the gold stuff that you have to look at closely is solar. If you zoom in, it goes all the way down to a 6-kilometer grid. So you can look at, the surroundings right here if you want to check their website. Now, the thing I want you to imagine is driving west on Route 80. And the answer is that in 2050 here, every single ridgetop would be lined wall to wall with wind turbines. And then once you get out of Pennsylvania into the beginning of Ohio, what you'll see is on the horizon, wall to wall wind turbines for the next 1,000 miles, all right? That whole blue swath across the country. It's an incredible investment in land required to take us there using these renewable technologies. So think about it. Are you going to have an NIMBY reaction when all of this starts building? Next slide, please. Okay, so our policy recommendations are in a table. The table is available online. It's reconfigurable. If you spend 10 or 15 minutes with this table, you'll know everything that we recommended. It's got icons in it that are explained so you can figure out what all the policies are for, who has to do them, how much they cost, and all that sort of stuff. And I'm just going to show you a few of them. Next slide, please. Yeah, so the first one is the one with the box here. And this is something that is politically not very popular these days, but it's an economy-wide price on carbon. The economy-wide price is, we think, necessary because you see that little piggy bank icon that is dark green? That's a cost-effective transition. Economy-wide price on carbon means that's costs less than it otherwise would. And so the money is available to use for other things. Ours is $40 a ton, which is high enough that they're going to have to be ancillary policies to protect export-exposed businesses and also to protect poor families who are already struggling to pay their energy bills. But at the same time, it's still too low to affect the entire transition. And that's because we don't have good economic studies showing how we could identify who was going to be damaged by a carbon price higher than this. Next slide. So in addition to this economy-wide price on carbon, we have standards. A zero emissions electricity standard for electricity generation that reaches 75% of our electricity in 2030, zero emissions vehicles that reach 50% of sales in 2030, and zero emissions manufacturing standards for home heating, cooking, and cooling appliances. And if these look familiar, it's because they're what Biden has announced in his plan just within the last week. Next slide, please. Oh, so those standards would affect the transition, would cause the transition to take place, even if you didn't have a price on carbon. It would simply cost more than if you did put the price on carbon. At least half of the policies are designed to promote a fair and equitable transition because we think that socialist acceptance is really going to be where the action is. And that's certainly borne out by the conversations in Washington. Our plan starts with 10 regional centers. We've done this before with regional planning commissions that are meeting places for governors and mayors and county commissioners and legislators, where you get to learn about what is likely to be coming to your region and what the issues are. These centers issue community block grants for analysis and planning so that municipalities can meet. There are all kinds of diversity and inclusion guidelines for how the planning needs to be done. They're aided technically by a Department of Energy Extension Service that provides technical know-how for this. And so once a community decides what it's facing, then then you need to turn to programs to attract different industry, to retrain workers, and so on. Most of the primary distribution of aid we recommend to be in an independent national transition corporation, which is funded upfront by the government, so it's not subject to an annual appropriation. And we have history in the US of doing exactly this successfully. There are extensive education and training programs, and there's also a White House Office of Equitable Energy Transitions that's designed to track this and make sure it really has teeth. The Biden plan now includes some of these things, but not, in my view, a complete package yet. Next slide, please. So that's all I have for you. I'd be happy to take any questions. I believe I'm on time here. So enjoy your annual meeting. And if there's time for questions, I'll answer them.
Steve, thank you. That was terrific. And it's so wonderful to have an optimistic presentation on an issue that has befuddled us for so many years. I want to start with a question about the political viability, but the question is, assuming the U.S. Congress will not take any action, how much of the president's plan could still be implemented? We all remember the Obama plan that the Republicans in Congress and in some of the legislatures were trying to block, but it was largely administratively under their control.
Yeah, so the I'm going to answer the question a slightly different way. How much of it could be enacted without a climate bill, but with, say, some of this folded in under an infrastructure bill together with executive actions? And so if you get an infrastructure bill and my group has communicated with Senator Manchin's group for a long time, so I think we're going to get an infrastructure bill. Let me just say that, right? And the thing is that with those two, you're really off to the races on this thing, because the wind and solar being the cheapest levelized cost of electricity, and lithium-ion batteries being, I mean, if you have an electric car, you like your electric car, right? This is almost tipping over anyway. And so we just need to accelerate it to try to get under the 2-degree wire for climate change. And so you really do a lot of it with that. And if you got 8 years of that sort of activity, by then the jobs in the new industries are a real source of momentum to continue. I should say also that under normal circumstances, there are elements of this that would attract bipartisan support. But the politics of passing something under budget reconciliation, I don't know that you'll attract any, right? That said, once it's done, if you come back and say, let's have a bill to protect the fossil workers who are going to lose their jobs, my guess is you could get something passed that's standalone and bipartisan.
That's great to hear you say that. Last question, for those watching at home who want to do something to address the climate threat, what's the one thing you'd encourage them to do?
There's so much. It's easy to say that, you want to live a lifestyle that emits less. And that is true. And there are many ways to do that. And the Watershed Institute could help you with that. All right. I certainly do all of those things. When the furnace goes, you install heat pumps and so on. Right. So do what you can do that way. But this is an area in which political momentum is absolutely critical. And right now, this year, this is the crunch time. We get the job done this year, and this thing starts to gather momentum on its own. This is a technological transformation that's going to happen. We want it to happen fast enough, and it won't happen otherwise without some policy. So if there's ever been a time to dig into your time budget and put time into lobbying your legislators, maybe supporting them politically with donations and that sort of thing, this is the time. And in my view, this is one, at least, of the signature issues that confront humanity. So that's what you can do.
Well, Steve, thank you so much for your leadership and for joining us tonight and sharing what I take as a very optimistic and hopeful presentation. So thanks for joining us, and we look forward to seeing you again soon.
Very good. Nice to be here.